Parte de los palestinos. Y también me gustaría saber que me explicara por qué Al-Fatah entrena a niños para que salgan con armas a la calle, poniendo en riesgo clarísimamente sus vidas. Gracias.
¿Estabas con ellos? Estabas tú con ellos. Dame una prueba de que tú lo que dices es verdad, es cierto. Tú me preguntas una pregunta.
Hi, welcome to Club Cruise. I'm your host, Becky Johnson. And what you just saw was a clip from Palestinian television, which was provided by one of my guests here. One of the most controversial topics that the world is facing right now is the Palestinian-Israeli conflict in the Mideast. Many organizations in the United States have gotten involved in this conflict, and many of them are working to bring about a peaceful resolution to this deadly conflict that's occurring. On tonight's show, I have two guests with me. On my immediate right, I have Scott Kennedy, who is a former mayor of Santa Cruz, currently a member of the Santa Cruz City Council. However, on tonight's show, you're appearing as the coordinator of the Mideast program at the Research Center for Nonviolence.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, thanks for coming, Scott. And then on my far right, I have Lee Kaplan. Lee Kaplan runs the Israel Resource News Agency in the United States, and you're also the founder of Davka, which is a campus communications organization.
Proactive campus communications organization, yes.
Okay, thank you for coming to the show, Lee.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, I'm going to just kind of ask some questions and kind of take turns with this. And you know, I wanted to invite you, Scott, so that we could bring some of these issues out in the forefront. The Resource Center for Nonviolence has come under some fire lately. Some letters in the Sentinel that have been critical. I guess there was a speaker that the Resource Center for Nonviolence invited up at UCSC campus that was somewhat controversial. And then Lee takes a somewhat opposing view, I imagine, on some of these issues. So let's begin. So Scott, you know, you've long been an advocate of a two-state system.
Yes.
With Israel setting up a separate Palestinian state. And yet Israel Prime Minister Barak in 2000 offered a proposal to the Palestinians that many Israelis felt was quite generous. And yet he turned that offer down and launched the Intifada, or the uprising. Intifada.
Right.
A little correction here already. So do you think that this was a reasonable offer? And doesn't this show that the Palestinians are not really interested in their own independent state?
I've favored what's called a two-state solution since 1975, actually before the PLO formally accepted two states as a possible political resolution. I believe that the concept of two states living side by side on land that's contested by two different national groups is the only viable way of resolving the conflict short of genocide or apartheid, which I don't believe is in the interest of either people. And so I've been, for what is that, almost 30 years, been advocating the idea of a two-state solution. That's not based on the idea that Israel should set up two states, but it's based on the fact that Israel itself was the product of a United Nations resolution that partitioned mandatory Palestine into two states, Israel and Palestine. I think it's a legal resolution. It has the moral high ground, and the focus should be on the sustainability of the two states. The main problem with Barak's offer, for one, we know that even later that year in December in Taba, Barak already was willing to talk about other terms, so it's not as though that was the last and final offer. From the Palestinian point of view, there were several major issues that weren't addressed. But from an American point of view, which is the point of view I reflect, the interest of U.S. foreign policy, I don't think that the Barak offer was sustainable. I don't think the Palestinian state that would have resulted from that would have been a sustainable peace agreement that would have lasted for more than 2 or 3 years. And I think at this point, after 50 or 100 years of conflict, however you want to define it,
So you don't think
I think the need is to find a sustainable resolution.
You don't think that this indicates the Palestinians are not interested in a separate state?
No, the Palestinians have accepted formally through their Palestine National Council, through the Oslo Peace Accords, they've accepted the concept or the idea of a two-state partition. They retroactively approved the UN resolution, which created the two states. So formally, legally, politically, they're committed to a two-state solution.
Okay, let's let Lee have a chance to respond.
Scott, I'm a little bit puzzled by that. I looked at your website, and you had an editorial in there where you said you, first of all, stand for the law of return. And the Palestinian position on the law of return is that every Palestinian who wants to go beyond the green line and go back inside Israel, the state of Israel as it is today, which would change the demographics and make it an Arab-dominated country, and basically dismantle Israel, is their main sticking point. But let's go to that two-state solution you were talking about for a moment. You're the director of a Mideast forum of some kind, you were saying? I'm a little bit puzzled because with the Oslo Accords, what was offered was 97% of the West Bank. The additional 3% was to be offered from other land that belonged to Israel in exchange for areas where some settlements were where Israel felt they were vital to Israel's security. The fact of the matter is that Arafat at Johannesburg, after he signed the Oslo Treaty, and this was a treaty, you believe in treaties, I assume, Scott, he stated very clearly, and this was also broadcast on Palestinian TV, that this was only an interim phase. In other words, we've made the agreement. When we have the West Bank and Gaza, next we go into the next phase is to take over the rest of Israel. So this is what the reality is. It sounds very nice when you talk about a two-state solution, and I can tell you right now that Israelis, both right and left, want a two-state solution. And I can tell you that for the Palestinian side, it's a propaganda thing for the West, because what they want is the dismantlement of the state of Israel.
Okay, Lee, a lot of the words that have been used in this debate about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict some of these words are very heated and controversial. Could you talk about the word occupation in terms of Israeli occupation of the West Bank? And also Scott mentioned the word apartheid.
Good point.
Those two words.
Good point. When you talk about occupation, the West Bank was not occupied in 1993 when they signed the Oslo Accords. There was Area A, Area B, and Area C, and it was supposed to be a phased withdrawal over the period of 5 years, and they were not occupied. And the Israeli army did not go in there until they were attacked by suicide bombers. And in fact, Sharon, who they like to vilify, withdrew 10 times. And each time he withdrew, he said, all we are demanding is no violent attacks for 1 week. And most people here in this country don't realize that Israel suffers 21 terrorist attacks a day. The ones you see on TV are the major bombings. But you have drive-by shootings, you have knifings, you have constant attacks going on. And I want to address one thing here, Scott. You used the word apartheid. Let's clarify something. Israel is a democracy. 18% of its population are Arab citizens. They have full civil rights. There are 14 Arabs in the Knesset, which is the parliament. And Arabs sue all the time in the courts in Israel, and they win against the government. That's including in the West Bank, where they're not Israeli citizens. At the same time, it's consistent in the West Bank and the Arab quarter of the Palestinians that no Jew may live in Palestine. That's clearly stated in their policy and their television. They say no Jews in Palestine. And the fact is, if anybody is engaging in apartheid, it is the Arab majority in that whole region, because they want Arab-Muslim hegemony over the entire region. And that's what the reality is. This use of the word apartheid It has buzzwords in the American community because of the apartheid that was practiced in South Africa. But if anybody is racist, it's the Arabs, not the Jews.
So, Scott, can you talk about the words occupation and apartheid?
Well, if you could play back the tape, what I said on apartheid was I said continuation of the current situation would require a situation either of genocide or apartheid, which is not in the interest of either people.
So you're not accusing the Israelis of practicing
No,
apartheid at this point in time?
No, I said if this would be a product. What he describes as the demographic problem related to the law of return would result in a situation where there would be a majority of Arab citizens in Israel, and Israel would have to choose between being a democratic state or a Jewish state. That's my understanding of his argument. But I wasn't, I was just saying that the idea of apartheid is antithetical, certainly to Jewish values as we know them in the United States. Why would somebody want to set up a political situation that required that? Or the alternative, which is genocide.
I've got to
The second point, which is, did you want to interrupt?
Well, I do want to interrupt because when
No,
you say,
please, feel free.
you make a comment which is actually a comment that I would call a comment of exclusion. You made a statement, either it has to be a democracy or a Jewish state. It is a democracy and it is a Jewish state. And the fact is the Arabs are not democratic. They're not even democratic in the Palestinian Authority, and they never were. They are all dictatorships. And Arafatistan is a military dictatorship. And the premise that if the Arabs are allowed to flood into Israel, that it's going to be a democracy. And again, you're calling for the dismantling of Israel. You're just putting it into other words. And I don't mean to interrupt, but when you talk like
go
that,
ahead.
well,
allowed you to
no, but
interrupt.
when you make statements like that, they're deceptive comments because Israel is a democracy and Israel is a Jewish democracy. And the Arabs are not democratic. They don't want to flood into Israel and have a democratic country. What they want to do is they want to have another Muslim Arab dictatorship. And let's clarify that. The problem in the media today is too many people make comments like you just made, whether they're out of ignorance or they're out of exclusion in order to fool people. And I have to come in and interrupt when that happens. That's my job.
Do you want to respond to that?
Well, I just want to say that I guess this is what we call being proactive.
That's right.
But I accept the format where each of us is allowed to speak. He made several statements that I thought were objectionable or that I don't agree with, but I'm not going to get into interruption and correction of each sentence.
Okay.
But I would appreciate having the same ground rules that I respect with Mr. Kaplan, which is that he's allowed to answer his questions. I'm allowed to answer mine, and I assume the listening audience understands that we disagree about a lot of these things.
Okay, well, just as long
On the
as we're
question of
trying to
occupation, occupation, I believe, is a legal term related to the fact that the West Bank and Gaza Strip were militarily occupied by Israel in the '67 war. It's, I think, an understanding that's shared virtually universally. If it's not an occupation, what is it? If
Occupying whose land, though?
Occupying the West Bank and Gaza Strip. These are geographical areas.
Which belongs to who ultimately?
I believe it belongs to people who are living there.
So the Jews and the Palestinians?
Absolutely. When Mr. Kaplan, for example, said, which I didn't interrupt him to point out, that the Palestinians, as a matter of policy and absolutely consistently refused the idea of of Jewish people living within the West Bank or Gaza, that's not my experience, what I've heard or seen. I've seen statements by the mayor of Hebron, for example, saying that he would welcome descendants of the people who lived in Hebron before they were forced out by Arab action in the 1920s, that they would welcome those people returning. Their only condition is they believe that Jews living within a Palestinian state should live by the rules of the Palestinian state, just as Arabs who live within the Jewish state of Israel have to abide by the laws of Israel.
So you don't
They're just asking for reciprocity.
So you don't advocate dismantling the settlements and moving the Jews out of the
I
West
believe
Bank?
that Jews should have the right to live in a Palestinian state.
Okay, Scott, Israel is undoubtedly a heavily armed, state-of-the-art military, and the Palestinians are vastly less armed. The impression is that they only have rocks and a few guns. Is it correct to state that the position of the Resource Center for Nonviolence is being essentially that our sympathy should be with the Palestinians who only want their freedom from oppression and opportunity for self-rule?
No, I think the position of the Resource Center for Nonviolence is rooted in nonviolence, in the spirit of Gandhi and King. We believe that People should enjoy human and civil rights. People should enjoy national self-determination so long as it doesn't compromise or interfere with the self-determination of their neighbors, and that the Palestinians and the Israelis have equal rights. That which we claim for the Israelis must also be extended to the Palestinians. Those rights and duties that we extend to the Palestinians must also be extended to the Israelis. That's our position consistently. So we favor those forces in Israel and Palestine who are working for a resolution of the conflict that's not based on brute force, that's based on the principles of international law, respect for human rights, and a sustainable political resolution rather than an unsustainable military resolution, which is the situation we have now.
So, Lee, would you like to respond to that?
Well, let's go into occupation first when we use that word. And Scott, I guess you don't really know the history of the area that well, but there were actually 23 major Jewish settlements in the West Bank and Gaza in 1948 when they had the partition plan. And those Jews were actually driven out of the area by the Jordanian and Egyptian armies. And from 1948 until 1967, those areas that you're calling occupied were actually part of Jordan and were part of Gaza. And the Arabs that lived in that region never demanded to have a Palestinian state or really considered themselves Palestinians. In fact, I have a quote from one of Arafat's right-hand men from 1970. This is, 1977. This is a quote from the Executive Committee of the PLO, Zahir Mushain, who was Arafat's right-hand man. And he stated, this is an exact quote, "The Palestinian people does not exist. The creation of a Palestinian state is only a means for continuing our struggle against the state of Israel and for our Arab unity. In reality today, there is no difference between Jordanians, Palestinians, Syrians, or Lebanese. Only for political and tactical reasons do we speak today about the existence of a Palestinian people. Since Arab national interests demand that we posit the existence of a distinct, quote, Palestinian people, unquote, to oppose Zionism." Now, if you wanted to ask me, does the average Palestinian who might be living in a refugee camp that the Arab nations kept as a festering wound as an excuse to try and dismantle the state of Israel all these 54 years, I would say, yeah, he probably thinks he's a Palestinian. But the fact of the matter is, when we talk about occupation, this is a double-edged sword. It isn't the case of Israelis occupying. And even Resolution 242, which the Palestinians just love to talk about the United Nations resolutions, doesn't say it's all occupied land. It says Israel must withdraw from most of the territories. And there are areas in there which were traditionally Jewish areas, like Hebron and Bethlehem. And the areas where they have settlements, the Jews have always lived for millennium. So it's a much more complicated question. And what was the second point that Scott addressed? I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought.
Well, I'm not sure.
You discussed about Jews living in the West Bank. I can tell you right now, if you watch their Palestinian television, you'll see constant exhortations to kill Jews, let alone let them live in the West Bank. And by the way, Palestinian television is not like our TV, where somebody goes on air and just expresses a personal opinion, and that's one guy speaking. You're talking about a controlled media in a military dictatorship, and everything that is shown on TV has to meet the approval of the government. And maybe it'll be educational for you, Scott, because if you're as much for peace as you say you are, I'd love you to watch these tapes and see the mullahs chanting to kill Jews and to drive them from the land. And this is official Palestinian television. I'd like you to see children taught that they're supposed to kill Jews from this high. This is something that you either you're not seeing it from whoever you're talking to over there, which is possible. Maybe they want you to know the party line and nothing else. But it might educate you. And if you're really advocating peace, because Israel wants peace, and Israel wants a two-state solution, then maybe you need to see this kind of stuff. Because I don't really see this in the stuff coming out of your center.
Can I respond?
Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to say that I think we view the conflict fundamentally in different ways. You know, to my way of looking at it, both the Palestinians and the Israelis have their own national narrative, their own view of this conflict. And you can raise almost any point and match it tit for tat, point for point. I'm not interested in that. I don't view it that way. My own view is a U.S. citizen and taxpayer that's concerned about our country's role in the world. And I believe that when the United States lends its military and political support to any foreign body, it should have certain criteria or certain values that it insists on. Respect for human rights, that our weapons are used for defensive purposes only, not offensively, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not here like to defend the Palestinian position. There are plenty of Palestinians who could do that if you would be so generous as to invite one. So I've seen the TVs, I've also seen the TV statements, I've seen positions by Israelis that reflect an utterly racist and exclusionary view of Arabs. I see no purpose in quoting the most extreme views of those being voiced unless you're not interested in a resolution to the conflict. If you're interested in taking one position, supporting it no matter what, then that's a fine so-called proactive position to take. Okay. But I've seen certainly plenty of evidence on the other side that I could quote. I'm not interested in that. I'm trying to find some way that the U.S. presence can be facilitative of progress towards a resolution, not just sowing the seeds for future war.
I wanted to move on to about the suicide bombings. And now, Lee, the suicide bombings are really terrible.
Awful.
But aren't they done by a handful of extremists? And isn't it wrong to condemn the entire Palestinian people for the acts of a few?
Well, ample evidence has come out that it's actually done with the cooperation of Yasser Arafat. Many of the suicide bombers are members of Fatah, Al-Aqsa, Tanzim, any one of the 12 security forces that they supposedly have. And Arafat never arrests these people and puts them in jail. It would be one thing to say that the terrorist bombings are done by desperate extremists and it doesn't represent the entire population as a whole. But the fact is, population polls in the West Bank have shown that 88% of the Palestinians think they're a good thing. Every time they do a suicide bombing, Arafat gives an annuity, paid for by Saddam Hussein, by the way, who is not exactly an ally of the United States, to these people. He gets money from the Saudis. They're given a lifetime annuity. They're given free medical care for life. He names streets and schools after them. And if you want to suggest to me that the government there, if you don't like Arafat, maybe that's another story, but if you want to suggest to me that the government there is not responsible for inciting the problems and responsible for not arriving at a peaceful solution, you're not going to be able to do it because the facts just show it's not true.
You want to respond to that, Scott?
I consistently condemn suicide bombings. Mm-hmm. I believe that we're interested in living in a world where there's the rule of law, not the rule of force or the rule of the jungle. We don't support attacks, certainly not attacks against civilian populations. So I have no problem with most of what Mr. Kaplan said. I certainly have always condemned the suicide bombings and support those Palestinians who've been outspoken against them.
Now,
can I make a real quick comment about that? Yasser Arafat has always condemned the suicide bombings too. In fact, it's an interesting thing. In the Arab press, he lauds them and he calls the people Shahid Balal, which in Arabic means hero martyrs. Mm-hmm. In the English press, he condemns them. And another interesting thing, too, is that his chief lobbyist in Washington is a man named Edward Abington, who used to be the consul general in Jerusalem and gets $2.5 million a year from Arafat. After some of the recent terrorist bombings, Arafat never made any condemnations of the bombings, but Abington put out press releases to the American press saying he had. So the fact is, if you feel the way you say you feel, I would assume that you don't support this Palestinian government that's in power now by any means, or its leader.
I think both of the governments have demonstrated amply they're prepared to use violence even at the cost of innocent civilians. After a one-ton bomb was dropped in a residential apartment in a densely packed neighborhood, Sharon and the head of the Air Force both said, "We have nothing to apologize for." You weren't a quarter of an inch off target on that, even though 14 civilians, 9 children were killed.
What about
the question is, do you support the death of civilians? And I absolutely don't. Whether they're Israelis or Palestinians, I don't accept those weapons, those actions that are based on the death of innocent civilians.
Scott,
you want to talk about the Shahid?
So can you make the same statement?
Yes, I can.
Thank you.
Yes, Scott.
Then we can agree.
What you're doing,
I'm being
killing
proactive.
Civilians
yeah, I understand you're being proactive. Let me be proactive with you. What you're doing is you're using, again, the words of exclusion. Shaheda, who was that terrorist who was killed in that bombing, number one, he killed over 100 Israeli women, children, and some men in terrorist attacks. They also had intelligence that he was planning 7 mega-terror attacks, which was supposed to kill many more people. And
so you accept the killing of the civilians as collateral damage.
My attitude about the killing of the civilians is a Palestinian tactic, which is well known over 54 years of them hiding themselves among civilian population so as to prevent the Israelis from attacking them. And the Israelis do have what
I
they
don't
call...
think there's any evidence that prevents them from attacking.
You know, I can guarantee you, Scott, that if this guy had killed your family and it was your loss in that situation and there was a chance to take him out, you would have done it. And I think Ariel Sharon...
At the expense of five other families?
I think...
Would you do it at the expense of 5 other families?
What about the 100 other families that suffered even more losses on the Israeli side?
I think we have to get towards a political solution that gives each party something that they can live with and has something at stake in. And that would be a two-state solution.
We're at the end of our show.
Really?
And if people wanted to get more information about the Resource Center for Nonviolence, how would they contact you?
If you go to the Resource Center's website, rcnv.org, link yourself to the Israeli peace movements, because there's a different Israel than the one that's represented tonight, thank goodness.
And Lee, if people want to get a hold of Israel Behind the News?
They can go to www.israelbehindthenews.com. And as for these Israel peace movements that he's talking about, a lot of them are fronts for the Arabs funded by Arab money, such as Jewish Voice for Peace, Tikkun, and other groups. And if you want to know the truth about them, go see our website and contact us.
Okay, thank you both for coming on with this
I hope
controversial
if you have
topic.
Mr. Kaplan for a follow-up, you'll allow me to come on also.
We'll have
That
you
would be
on.
wonderful.
I'd
Thank
love
you.
to have you on again.
Thank you.
In the future, Scott.
Just curious, I didn't mention it on the air, you've been 30 times to the Middle East. Who paid for your trip each time?
Paid for it myself.
You paid for it yourself?
Yeah. Or when I lead a delegation, like I'm taking a delegation in September, we have 12 members. My costs are divided by 12 and paid for by those who
Does
go.
your organization get any money from the Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, any other Arab organizations?
What do you think?
I think you do.
You're wrong.
Well, we'll find
But
out.
that's not the first time tonight.